Don't make me angry, Calidor. I don't need any man's help.
Maybe you don't say it out loud, but I'm willing to bet you've got some good old-fashioned sword and sorcery flicks included in your list of guilty pleasure watches. Don't worry, I'm not calling you out because it's the same thing over here. There's just something so wonderfully unhinged about them, despite most of them being made with questionable budgets, rubber monsters, and weird action sequences. And the ones led by fierce, scantily armored, sword-wielding heroines are even more cheesy at times, but isn't that just part of the charm? Most of these were shameless cash grabs, but putting all criticisms aside, these movies did something quite wild for their time. Having women at the front and center as warriors and mercenaries wasn't always done well, but these roles were otherwise almost exclusively played by male actors. For every break-the-glass-ceiling moment, there existed an eye-roll-worthy costume or a questionable plot choice lurking just around the corner, but that's just what this genre needed. These films weren't aiming for subtlety, they were boisterous and proud of it. Even now, whether you're here for nostalgia, action, or just the spectacle, they're still fun to watch. So if you don't have a sword, grab your popcorn bucket as we take you through some cheesy yet unforgettable female-led adventures. Let's get into it. Sorceress, 1982. This is definitely a guilty pleasure movie because a lot happens during the runtime, one after the other, and you're guaranteed to get a good laugh at just how bizarre it is. It begins with the evil wizard Tragon looking to sacrifice his firstborn child to Caligula, a god. He actually ends up having twins, and his wife refuses to tell him which one was born first. She manages to escape from him to save her kids and convinces a peasant to raise both baby girls as boys. However, Tragon pursues her and inflicts a fatal wound. With help from the hippie wizard Krona, his wife manages to stab him with a spear and magically banish him for 20 years before passing away herself. Krona blesses the infants with his magical power and martial arts skills and asks them to invoke the name Vital whenever they're in danger. 20 years later, Tragon comes back, still insistent on sacrificing his first child. The twins, Mara and Mira, who have now grown up as boys, are then joined by a satyr named Pando, who is, of course, an open pervert, by the way, and a barbarian named Erlich, as well as a Viking named Baldar, as they set out on their journey to defeat their father. Said father had earlier attacked the adoptive parents of the twins, but his forces had raped their adoptive sister. Mara and Mira defeat them but are unable to save their loved ones. Krona, who has now become very old, appears out of nowhere and apologizes for not being able to save them. Now, when the twins spend more time with their friends, Erlich and Baldar are flustered to learn that they're actually women, not men. One of the weirdest highlights from the entire film happens when Tragon's trained apes throw exploding fruit at them, and one ape in particular takes a creepy liking to Mira. Finally, Mara, who is in fact the firstborn, and Erlich are captured and brought to Tragon. Erlich is actually revealed to be a prince, so Tragon tries to force him and his daughter to mate to make the sacrifice more special, and also more problematic, but, that's just our opinion. The two of them do have an intimate encounter, but guess what? Mira, who's elsewhere, is able to feel the same sensations as Mara and starts to writhe around. Pando the Perv is really excited by this, considering it an invitation, but Baldar stops him, thankfully. They're then cast into a pit while trying to rescue the others, where the weird ape who wanted Mira for pretty scandalous reasons finds them. Oh, and there are zombies as well, because you can never have too many bad guys, right? Fortunately, Pando did one right thing earlier and rallied an army of villagers and goats who then come to save the day. Meanwhile, Erlich tries to sacrifice Mara, but she utters the name Vital, and a benevolent deity that looks like a flying lion comes down from the sky and drives away Caligula. Tragon is also killed by his daughters. In the end, Erlich finds himself holding both sisters in his arms, and he says that the twins are two who are one. If you're thinking, what on earth just happened? All I can say is that I relate. I'm not very sure why the name of the movie is Sorceress, because there's no sorceresses in it from what we can tell, but that's not even in the top 15 of everything this film just takes for granted. If you don't mind some brain-rotten nudity, and you have some time to kill, then by all means you should check out Sorceress. You'll laugh, cringe, and probably lose a couple of brain cells, but you'll be thoroughly entertained. Hundra, 1983. Matt Cimber's Hundra begins as a rebellion against the male-dominated fantasy genre with a barbarian woman who can hold her own against any man. As one of the reviews on IMDb states, Hundra would rather have a horse between her legs than a man. But it soon becomes obvious that the feminist angle is simply part of the gimmick, and this is just another movie that exploits its female stars' physicality. So if you go into it expecting liberation and empowerment, you might be pretty disappointed, because hot women in tiny loincloths contradict that message. Hundra is an Amazonian warrior, and the only one in her tribe who has never been with a man. She wants to keep it that way too, but her tribe gets wiped out by hairy barbarians. As the sole survivor, she seeks out an old wise woman and asks for her advice, but is shocked to learn that she must find a man and have children with him to prevent the extinction of the Amazon race. She's still not entirely keen on doing the deed, but she has to save her race, so she embarks on a journey to find a compatible man to mate with. The first guy is rejected because he has horrible manners and he's also a sadist, and then she meets a murderous robber who's only interested in killing her. Next, she meets an effeminate pimp, and unfortunately for her, it seems like he doesn't deal with men. Finally, she meets a man who works as a healer and decides he's the one. The only issue is that he has problems doing it right, if he's asked to bluntly, and Hundra isn't in it for anything except getting a child, so she has a strict no foreplay policy. She asks other women how to get him into bed, and finally manages to seduce him. She gets pregnant and delivers a baby girl, but this poor girl can't catch a break because the baby is immediately kidnapped by an evil pagan priest, and in order to get her back, Hundra has to join a sinister ritual where the followers of the priest humiliate her. Thankfully, while this is happening, she's informed that her new friends have managed to free her daughter, so she goes full berserker on the cult members. The priest dies a pretty controversial death after being suffocated by a woman straddling his face. Hundra finally returns to her homeland, having secured the future of all Amazons, and the narrator ends by saying that her courageous spirit lives on in all women ever since. Laureen Landon's mechanical delivery of her lines as Hundra makes it abundantly clear that she wasn't hired for her acting chops, but rather her sex appeal and athleticism. Hundra swings her sword with a lot of fervor, but while donning a skimpy outfit that frequently gives very distracting glimpses. When she's not fighting, she likes to ride naked. Landon had actually remarked that a body double was planned for her nude scenes, but Matt Cimber tried to indirectly force her into doing it himself by making sure that the stand-in had a very different body type than her own. Despite its flaws, Hundra is actually one of the better Conan wannabes. It's a movie about a strong female lead, but not about feminism. The production design and action sequences are better than 90% of all sword and sorcery movies, and that's definitely saying something. This film is probably the only one I'd be willing to acknowledge as truly entertaining and not just mindless fun. It's a little surprising that Hundra doesn't have, to be frank, more of a cult following, if you know what we mean. She, 1984. You might think from the title that this movie definitely has to feature at least some little bit of feminist perspective, but again, this is sword and sorcery we're talking about. These movies are all centered around women, and for their time, that was feminist enough. She follows a post-apocalyptic world 23 years after a devastating nuclear war. Tom, Dick, and their sister Harry, very creative names we know, are introduced at the beginning, and Harry gets abducted by a tribe called the Norks. To rescue her, Tom and Dick set out on a dangerous journey and were captured by a matriarchal tribe called the Urix. Their leader is She, played by Sandal Bergman, who decides to help them after hearing a prophecy from an old seer regarding a man she's destined to meet. She and her right-hand woman, Shanda, join the brothers, and the group encounters many post-apocalyptic tribes. They all have their own gods, with an army of mutants who have special abilities thanks to the radiation. One such godman, named Godan, gets enamored by She, but is then betrayed by his lieutenant, a woman in red who gets jealous of this fact. The group then encounters giants dressed in tutus, werewolves donning togas, mutants bandaged up like Egyptian mummies, vampires belonging to high society, and a man named Xenon who can create clones of himself. Finally, the Norks capture them, and all of them are forced to wear masks and fight gladiator style. They recognize each other at the last moment, and Harry finally appears on screen. She'd been forced to be a concubine of the Nork leader, who allows the group to leave, but says that he'll attack and enslave all Urix the very next day. She decides to set traps for the Norks before they can get to her tribe, and with her friends, she fights with dozens of Norks until Shanda arrives with Uric warriors and defeats the bad guys. Dick and Shanda decide to stay with the tribe because they've fallen in love, but Tom and She part ways despite being in love with each other. Along with Harry, he sets out to settle elsewhere, and and she watches them disappear over the horizon. Anyone who considers themselves a connoisseur of B-movies should watch this film. Basically, it's so bad and incoherent that it loops back around to becoming watchable after a while, and then it becomes bad again. There's also plenty of random rock music to crank up the tension, even when it's not applicable. The plot makes zero sense, and the production values are abysmal. The acting is disappointing too, but if she is that bad, you must be wondering why we've watched it multiple times, and all we can say is that the movie is just fun. It's 80s era cheese at its finest, and the nudity is more toned down here than in most of the other films of the time, but it's still very much a plot device. Yellow Hair and the Fortress of Gold. Laureen Landon and Matt Cimber reunited in Yellow Hair and the Fortress of Gold. That's it. That's the entire movie explained in just 7 words. Landon plays the titular Yellow Hair, yep, that's actually the character's name, an Apache woman who searched all of Mexico for an abandoned temple filled with gold, along with her sidekick, Pecos Kid. We're not actually sure if this can be termed sword and sorcery because it's less like Conan and more like Indiana Jones and Flash Gordon. Cimber probably wanted to surprise the audience with a genre break and make a boatload of money, but he didn't account for the fact that the other franchises featured people like Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher and also had enough budget for great special effects. Pecos Kid also looks like Han Solo lost his jacket, but anyways, the film opens with a group of bandits trying to find a lost tribe and getting killed in the process. This scene's actually pretty brutal, and there's actually a part of it that's reminiscent of the molten golden crown from the first season of Game of Thrones. Only the bandit leader returns, and it turns out that along with Pecos Kid and an evil colonel, he was in cahoots to steal all their gold from the tribe. Kid was actually raised by none other than Yellowhair's mother, who asks her daughter to rescue him because he had stolen a gold nugget and a pretty important map. As you can probably guess, Yellowhair is not actually an Apache woman. She's the long-lost princess of the tribe with all the gold. She saves Kid and stays back to marry the leader, and tells Kid he can take his gold and leave. However, it's then revealed that Yellowhair is going to be sacrificed, so much for being the princess, and Kid has a change of heart and saves her. But this results in the temple caving in, with the bandit leader and colonel standing in the way of the heroes. The film ends on a cliffhanger, and I for one believe that's because the people behind it just had no idea how to finish it. The movie title tells us that Yellowhair is the protagonist, and she is truly badass in most of her scenes, but in reality, it portrays Pecos Kid as the main hero who saves her, whilst also being the very reason for all the chaos in the movie. We didn't particularly enjoy this one because it pretty shamelessly portrays colonialists as victims, even when they're playing villains, and indigenous people as monsters. It heavily leans towards Western spaghetti caricature, and personally makes Hundra look like a better movie by miles. Laureen Landon is the only good thing about it, and she's not really a good actress, so you can probably imagine what a movie would be like with her being the most non-objectionable part of it. But if you want cheese and laughter and to just turn off your brain for a while, you could do a lot worse than Yellowhair and the Fortress of Gold. Red Sonja, 1985. Red Sonja is the brainchild of Robert E. Howard and is considered a spiritual sibling of Conan by many fans. Starring Brigitte Nielsen and Arnold Schwarzenegger, the movie is also set in the Hyborian Age. It opens with Sonja, the titular character, being violently raped and left to die. She had rejected the sexual advances of Queen Gedren, which led to the killing of her family and her own assault. Gedren's face was also scarred by Sonja. While she lies battered and broken, a female spirit hears her plea for revenge and inhabits her body. This gives her enhanced sword-fighting skills, but on the condition that she'll never lie with a man unless he's defeated her in a duel. She then starts to train under the Grand Master and mistrusts all men, partly because of her trauma and also because of the condition attached to her powers. Sonja's sister, Varna, is a priestess at a nearby temple and is preparing to banish the talisman, a mystical object of great power. It can be used and touched by women only, but has become too difficult to control. If men touch the talisman, they vanish into thin air. Gedren's army infiltrates the temple and kills all the priestesses in order to make it easy to capture the relic. Varna witnesses the queen stealing it and killing more priestesses, but she's mortally wounded and unable to prevent the theft. A lord named Kalidor finds her and brings Sonja to Varna. She tells her sister to find the talisman and send it to the darkness before it can destroy the world, and then she passes away. Kalidor offers to help Sonja, but she rejects him out of apprehension. She meets with Prince Tarn of Hablok, whose kingdom was ruled by Gedril. He asks her to be his cook because she's a woman, and Sonja refuses. She then fights Lord Brightag because he expected her to tend to him, sexually, of course. However, his troops surround her with no space for escape, and Calidor once again helps, having followed her discreetly. Sonja then frees a captive Prince Tar, who finally acknowledges her skills, and they travel to the Queen's castle, fighting along the way. Calidor flirts with her, but she refuses his advances and only agrees to his assistance because she learns that he is descended from the lords who had entrusted the talisman to the temple. During the final confrontation, said relic's power becomes unstable and it splits the ground open, creating a chasm filled with lava. Sonja defeats Gedril and pushes her into the chasm along with the talisman. A rising volcano envelops the castle, and our three heroes manage to escape just barely. Calidor, who was earlier told that he could have Sonja only if he overpowered her, duels with her. However, they're both unable to defeat the other, and so they end it with a kiss, while Tarn goes back to rebuild his kingdom. Originally, Ralph Bakshi was set to direct the film, but he was later replaced by Richard Fleischer, who also directed Conan the Destroyer. The critical reception for the film was mostly negative, with fans calling it a very uninspired ending to the Conan trilogy. You know how sometimes you just need a bad movie that you can make fun of and have a good time just doing that? Schwarzenegger has remarked that it was the worst film he had ever been associated with, and he had a running joke with his kids that they would have to watch it 10 times in a row as punishment if they behaved poorly. There are worse movies out there, of course, but Red Sonja unfortunately had the means to become just as iconic as Conan and failed spectacularly. Barbarian Queen, 1985. This film is true to its provocative name, featuring Lana Clarkson as Amathea. While her peaceful barbarian village was celebrating her wedding to Argan, Lord Arakur's men attacked the village. They brutally assaulted Amathea's sister, Taramis, took her, Argan, and a few others as prisoners, and slaughtered everyone else. Only Amathea herself, her handmaiden Estrild, and the female warrior Tiniara survived. They set out to get revenge for the villagers and rescue the prisoners. They come across a small camp of the forces they were looking for and kill the men. Taramis was also in the camp, but she had suffered a lot of trauma from her assault and thus was acting withdrawn and delusional. Finally, the women reached Arakur's realm and were smuggled inside by a band of underground resistance members, but they weren't willing to go against Arakur by themselves. When inside the city, Amathea found out that Argan and the rest of the male prisoners were being forced to fight as gladiators. Taramis sees Arakur from the streets and goes after him, and in order to get her back, Estrild is attacked and similarly brutalized. Amathea and Tiniara are captured while trying to defend her, and Taramis is allowed in by Arakur. Estrild is sent to become a member of the gladiators' harem and reunites with Argan. Together, they plot an uprising involving the other prisoners. While Tiniara is killed during an escape attempt, Amathea is sent to the dungeons to be tortured. Taramis, however, pretends to happily accept becoming Arakur's concubine. Here comes the weirdest part of the movie. The creepy torturer tries to rape Amathea, but she squeezes him so painfully in the process that he's forced to let her go, and then she pushes him into a pool of acid and makes her escape. The rebellion starts, and the gladiators fight with Arakur's forces. Amathea herself goes one-on-one against him, but is disarmed in the process. Just when she's about to be killed, Taramis stabs him in the back and kills him. Their revenge and mission complete, the women celebrate the liberation of the city. Now, look, they really tried to sell this as a movie about empowerment by having a mostly female main cast, and some people even consider the penis crushing to be a war cry against sexism, but this film really takes the exploitative genre to its heights. The violence and assaults are way overdone and become more glaring than everything else in the story, while the nudity just doesn't even feel required after a point. At least they didn't have the bad guy get killed by a man, but that's probably the only good thing about it. Even fans who generally like sword and sorcery cheese have called Barbarian Queen out for being all cheese and no story. On IMDb, one review called it an adventure cheapie made for voyeurs. If you're planning on watching it, please make sure there are 0 kids around. Amazons, 1986. Amazons starts by telling us that the spirits of the warriors are tied to magical trees, and the tribe is under attack by the evil King Kalungo. He gets his powers from the Weird Ways and the demon named Balgor. The Amazonian priest performs a ceremony, and the magical sword of Azundati is revealed to be in the future of Diala, a warrior from the tribe. The Emerald Queen thus asks her and Tashi, another warrior, to find the sword and use it to defeat Kalungo. However, Tashi's mother, Tashingi secretly tells her to take the sword for herself and kill Diala because Diala's mother had cut off Tashingi's arm during a fight over a man. I know how lame that sounds, but jealousy can be a dangerous thing. And as a matter of fact, Tashingi was actually working for Kolungo, as he had promised to make her the next Emerald Queen. The bad dude was obviously smarter than her, so he had his shape-shifting servant, Akam, follow the girls on their quest to kill them at the opportune moment. Diala and Tashi face numerous problems in the process. They're almost captured and assaulted by bandits first, and then a tribe of demon worshippers like Pagash. Both times, Diala risks her life to save Tashi, and the pair become close friends. Akam, too, disguises herself as a lioness and gains the warrior's trust. They finally meet a seer who tells them that all three will enter the cave where the sword is hidden, but only one will come out alive, and that person will also pay a hefty price. Inside the cave, Diala claims the sword, but Tashi is unable to double-cross her because they've become such good friends. However, Akam reveals herself and tries to kill Diala. Tashi pushes her out of the way, taking the hit and sacrificing herself. Diala eventually defeats Akam and then returns to the seer, who is revealed to be none other than the mystical Azundari. Equipped with what she needs, Diala kills both Balgor and Kolungo and is named the new commander of the Amazons. However, Tashingi destroys Diala's tree to try to kill her, but is crushed to death underneath it instead. Miraculously, Diala survives because the possession of the sword has made her immortal. She then reunites with Tashi, who's been brought back to life by Azundari. The storyline and dialogue are nothing to write home about, but this is definitely a better movie than most in the exploitation genre. For Amazon aficionados, it's fairly okay-ish. The hand-to-hand combat scenes come off reasonably well. The one thing that stood out for us, though, even with all the obvious nudity here, was that it wasn't as distasteful as Barbarian Queen. Fortunately, in Amazons, the gang rape doesn't actually happen, but in general, it is disturbing to watch almost nude women get roughed up by a bunch of big guys. I guess the fact that they all get killed off afterwards is supposed to make it okay, but another thing that we couldn't appreciate was the entire backstabbing plotline by using Tashingi as a disgruntled woman who couldn't swallow her pride because she couldn't have a man. Even for a sword and sorcery movie, they could have made her intentions less bitchy. Warrior Queen, 1987. This movie stars Sybil Danning as a queen from a foreign land who visits the Roman city of Pompeii. Pompeii's economy runs entirely on the slave trade, to the point where even thick-skinned people in the audience will have a hard time digesting the violence portrayed in the film. Danning's Bernice appears mostly disinterested most of the time she's there, but no one knows that she's secretly trying to free the slaves. Eventually, however, it catches on, and she invites the ire of most of the aristocrats. Warrior Queen has elements of both Satyricon and Caligula, but lacks the substance of either film, thanks in particular to a really poor script. The titular Warrior Queen also doesn't really engage in any fighting as such, but her intentions are certainly noble. But then again, this is an Italian film by a director of pornography with a B-movie cast and produced by Joe D'Amato, so it really is bad filmmaking at its finest. The UK version gets rid of all the nudity, cutting down the runtime by 15 minutes, but even this uncut version is just bland. It plays out like a straight costume drama. Now, the movie is about Pompeii, so the slave trade isn't even the most horrifying thing. In the end, of course, the volcano unleashes havoc. We hadn't noticed it at first either, but reviews mention how the producers liberally inserted clips from 1959's The Last Days of Pompeii just to give an epic feel to an otherwise boring film. In fact, we agree with one critic who said that they were cheering for the volcano to just end it all so we could finish the movie early. This is quite a funny film to watch if you can swallow all of the violence, of course, but if viewing in a serious mind, you'll be disappointed. We have to highlight two performances in particular that stood out, almost as an apology for how disturbing the film otherwise was. David Kane Houghton portrays the greedy owner of Pompeii's premier whorehouse in a truly creepy and decadent manner. He plays the heartless slave owner who has no regard whatsoever for the men or women he buys and rents out, and it's such a good performance that for a second, you might even forget that he's fictional. Mario Cruciani has a much smaller role as a handsome, innocent male slave who tries to protect a young girl sold into the same brothel as himself. However, his actions only end up bringing greater misfortune on them both. It's commendable how these two actors managed to play their roles so convincingly, even with a script that had no room for any sort of finesse. Both of them deserve a much better film than this, and for us, they're the only two reasons to spend any amount of time watching it. Deathstalker 2, Duel of the Titans, 1987. This film starts with an evil sorcerer named Jarek taking over the kingdom of Jazafir by creating a clone of Princess Evie, while the real princess escapes disguised as Rena the Seer. She meets Deathstalker, the wandering warrior, and enlists his help to get back her birthright and defeat Jarek. They face countless troubles from Sultana, Jarek's ally, and many misadventures follow. They try to rob a grave to get their hands on a magical artifact, but end up unleashing zombies. Deathstalker also gets captured by a band of Amazons who try him for crimes against womankind and have him wrestle their champion. Ultimately, the pair manage to ambush the bad guys, and Evie stabs her clone, severing Jarek's source of power. The climax comes with Deathstalker raising his sword against Jarek's minions, and Evie finally takes back her throne. The second part of the Deathstalker series has a reasonable premise, a satisfactory score, and is honestly very entertaining, but don't think that we're calling it an amazing movie. The big surprise for us was that, unlike most former models, Monique Gabrielle gave her all to the role of Princess Evie, as well as the clone, and she's the best reason to watch this movie. John Terlesky's look as Deathstalker is also reminiscent of Tom Cruise. He's not the muscle-bound Hulk that Rick Hill was from the first movie, and he knows it. This is a Deathstalker who understands that he's in a campy B-grade sword and sorcery film and is determined to have as much fun with it as he can. He takes nothing seriously, and almost everything is done with a wink at the audience. The movie has some very funny one-liners, and there's plenty of action and lots of laughs to be had watching this one. That's why we consider Deathstalker 2 the best in the series, because it doesn't try too hard to project the image that it's a Conan ripoff. Instead, it embraces the spoof and the parody elements and just makes sure that it's remembered for being funny, not trashy. And we know we added this one to the list, but it's not exactly female-centric in the same way most of the other films we spoke about are. But it is a more entertaining watch than any of them, that we can say for sure. Barbarian Queen 2, The Empress Strikes Back, 1992. I don't know why The Empress Strikes Back was added to the title when it could have been anything else, even just Barbarian Queen 2. It's a very vain and unoriginal reference to Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back, and since this film has nothing to do with outer space, and it was made almost a decade after the George Lucas film, we're not exactly sure what the producers were going for with that connection, but we'll give them an E for effort, I guess. Lana Clarkson plays Athalia, a tomboyish princess whose father, King Iko, one day mysteriously disappears. The resident bad guy, Ankaris, simply tells Athalia that the king died in battle. Ankaris demands that she give him the secret of the scepter so that she can become the next king. She doesn't, because she believes that her father is alive and divulging the secret will kill him. Ankaris' daughter, Tamis, tries to persuade her, and while Athalia manages to find the scepter, she doesn't recite the full incantation. So, she's sentenced to death, but manages to escape into the forest, where she meets a barbarian woman named Zarla, who comes from the village with the worst perms in the world. Athalia wrestles in the mud with the matriarch and becomes the leader of the village. Lots of stuff happens after this, which we can only term as brain rot, because if you try to understand why they happened, you'll just end up more confused. See, they capture Hofrax, Ankaris' commander, but then let him go instead of killing him, and of course he brings more trouble to them. Who could have possibly seen that coming, right? Clarkson again gets tied to a rack and tortured because a Barbarian Queen movie is incomplete without that sequence, and then she gets bitten by a venomous spider. She deliriously utters the secret of the scepter while recovering, and this is overheard by Tamis, who had taken on the appearance of a grown woman disguised as a rebel. She goes to activate the scepter using the spell, but her father fails to recognize her and kills his daughter, then kills himself out of grief for what he's done. By that time, Athalia had matured enough to become queen, and she tossed the scepter to the crowd because people's trust is the best magic out there. Yep, the film ends by praising democracy. This was even more bizarre than the first movie, and its only saving grace is that it held back on the mindless violence and abuse, so at least it didn't leave us with a bad taste in our mouths. Barbarian Queen 2 is one of the silliest and most amateurish films ever made, but boy, it sure is entertaining. That said, none of the movies we talked about are even close to being perfect. That rough around the edges feel is baked right into the sword and sorcery genre. The cheap sets, the flimsy costumes, the ridiculous special effects, and the questionable dialogue is all part of the experience. This genre thrives on defying logic as much as possible and makes its own rules. That unpredictability makes it cheesy and funny. I'll definitely say that some of these end up being distasteful while trying to appear pseudo-progressive, but you have to remember the time when these were made. The 80s were wilder than you can ever imagine, so if you're thinking of watching these, just remember to turn off your brain and let me know what you think of them. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more awesome content coming your way. You can't imagine how much it helps you in bringing you more of this type of stuff, and we really love making this stuff, so we really appreciate you sticking to the end with us. Thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and we'll see ya in the next one.